In this video, we will talk about parameters. We will talk about what parameters are and how to use them. In order to understand parameters better, we will go over 10 common use cases and introduce tips and tricks and common constructs like case and if-else statements. Parameters are often confused to being similar with filters. We will break down the differences. Lastly, we will introduce parameter actions. I'll see you in a bit. I have added chapters in the description down below if you want to jump to specific topics. I hope you will consider watching the whole video though, as there may be some new topics or new concepts or new tips and tricks that you may find useful. Let us start with some definitions. In Tableau's documentation, it defines a parameter as a workbook variable such as a number, date, or string that can replace a constant value in a calculation, filter, or reference line. There are a few important things to note here. A parameter exists at the workbook level, which means it can be seen and used across your workbook. This is important because this means you don't have to recreate parameters for each worksheet. There is also mention of a variable. A variable is a term used in programming which refers to a placeholder for a value, and that's what a parameter is. It holds a value that can be used to replace something that is referenced in places like a calculated field, a filter, a reference line, and a few others. The definition in the Cambridge Dictionary is also helpful in understanding what parameters do. In here, it highlights that parameters can establish or limit how something must happen or how something can be done. As far as Tableau is concerned, a parameter is a field similar to all the fields you see in your sidebar, but it's one that can accept input, usually from your end users, and the values that it accepts can change how your charts or dashboards behave. It's just like ordering. The parameter can ask our end users, "What would you like?" And the answer can vary from user to user. And depending on what our end users say, what gets prepared would be different. Now that we have defined parameters, let's move on to the typical steps we follow when we use parameters. Please note that all of these will be demoed later on. The first step is to create our parameter. Second, we may opt to show our parameter control. There will be times when we may decide not to show the control at all and simply use the parameter for some background calculations. Third step, we may need to create a calculated field. But note that this is optional as well. This will really depend on how we intend to use the parameters. There are certain use cases that don't require the creation of calculated fields. And fourth, we need to use the parameter. The last step is important to remember. Parameters by themselves don't do anything or affect anything. We still need to use this parameter somewhere in our worksheet for it to affect something. In other words, we need to wire it in. Let's jump to Tableau and look at some initial use cases for parameters. Let's start with looking at filtering for top N, and I will show you two ways to do this. For the first use case, if we simply wanted to show the top records in our view, in this case, let's say top 10 customers, top 20 customers, one of our options is to simply go to our discrete field and from here, choose Filter. In the Filter window, there is a top tab. And from here, we can select By Field. By default, this selects top 10, but we can create a parameter from here. So when you click on the drop-down, there is an option to create a new parameter. When we select this option, this gives us the Create Parameter window. In the Create Parameter window, we can specify the name of the parameter. By default, because this is a top N, Tableau already selects an integer for us with a current value of 10 and a range of values from 1 to 100. So let's click on OK first and click on OK again. Let's also rename our parameter. So I'm just going to right-click, rename. I'm going to call this top N. And let's also show the parameter. So right-click on this parameter and then show parameter. So right now this gives us top 10, but should we decide to change it, I can move this slider and the view will change based on my input. Now with top ends, and especially relative top ends, there are special considerations when you have multiple filters. I do have another video on filters that discusses this in more detail. I will link it up in the card above and description down below if this is something that you will find useful. Now let's delete this parameter and introduce the creation a different way. So let's delete this. Instead of going through the dimension, we are going to explicitly create our new parameter. So on the drop-down, create parameter. This gives us a very similar window to what we have just seen. So let's create a new parameter again. Let's call this top n. We can choose our data type. So in this case, still an integer. Maybe the current value is 10 as well. For the value when the workbook opens, for different kinds of parameters, we may want this to draw from our data source, but for our purposes right now, we're going to leave it as is. We can also decide to change the display format. Right now, for our purposes, we're going to accept the default. Now for allowable values, all usually means a text box, which means we can just type in the value that we want. We can also decide to type in a list of values and it will be shown as a drop-down. Or we can also specify a range of values, and by default, this is going to be shown as a slider. I'm going to leave this as all for now. It's going to be a text box, it's going to be free form, and it will accept any valid numeric values. Let's click on OK. Let's right-click and show the parameter. Remember, this parameter does not do anything until we wire this in. So even if I change this to 5, it will not do anything to our workbook. We need to use this in our worksheet to affect some kind of change. Now in this case, I'm going to click on the drop down on customer name under filter and top by field. From here, we can select the new parameter that we just created. So select top n, click OK. So now we have top 5 because that's what we have selected. But should we change this to 10? You should see your view change as well. We change this to 20, it will change as well. Another way we can create a top n is by using table calculation functions. There are different functions we can take advantage of, but in this demo, we are going to use a function called index. The index function simply gives us a sequential number. In this case, I'm going to double click on an empty area in the marks card and type in index. I'm also going to convert this field to discrete because I want to show this as a column in the rows shelf. So on the drop down, discrete, and then move this to our row shelf. Now the last thing we need to do is to only show the records that are within our selected top n. And this will require that we create a calculated field. So let's create a calculated field on the drop down, create calculated field, and in here, let's type in a name in top n. And we simply want to know if this index is less than or equal to our selected top n parameter. Let's click OK. Let's drop this new field into our filter shelf and only leave the records for when it is true. So let's click on OK and OK again. In here, we can also decide to hide our index column. So on the drop down, uncheck show header, and this is our top 20 customers. When we change our parameter value, it should change our view as well. Let's now look at how we can use parameters in a moving average chart. When we have very busy or very volatile charts, it can be helpful to add a moving average, as it can smooth out the data and expose some patterns. In this example, I have a daily sales chart, but you can see that it's very busy. We can add a moving average to this chart. Let's copy sum of sales by pressing Ctrl, dragging it over. And in the second sum of sales, clicking on the drop down, adding a quick table calculation, moving average. Let's make this into a dual axis chart. So on the drop down of the second pill, dual axis, let's make sure the colors are different. So I'm going to set my moving average to a different color. And we are also going to synchronize the axis. So right click, synchronize axes. We can also now hide the second header. Right click, uncheck show header. Now this moving average by default is a 3-unit moving average. For this chart, the unit is day. So we are looking at a 3-day moving average. However, if we want our end users to be able to play around with this moving average and take a look at the patterns, we can add our parameter. Let us have a closer look at this moving average calculation. So on the drop down of the pill, let's edit the table calculation. And in here, we can see that this calculation considers the previous 2 values as well as the current value. Now, if we want to make this number dynamic, we need to do this in a calculated field. So let's close this and let's drag over the pill that has the table calculation onto our sidebar. Let's rename this to moving average and let's inspect this. So right click, edit. So what we can see is that the previous 2 days is hard coded in the formula, and we can replace this with a parameter value. Let's close this first. Let's create a new parameter, create parameter, and let's call this previous end days. Let's change this to an integer. Let's leave this as 2 as a default value, but we can consider a range of values. So perhaps a minimum of 1 day, a maximum of 100 days, and also maybe a step size of 1. Let's click OK, and let us show this parameter. Remember that by default, this will not do anything. We need to wire this in. So let us go back to our moving average calculated field, right click, edit. And in this case, instead of a -2, we are going to replace this with our parameter value. So let's drag that over, previous end days, and let's click apply. Adding this parameter can also help us understand what moving averages do. So in this case, the more days that are considered in a moving average, the smoother the pattern becomes. So we can see some kind of pattern now, even though the main chart is still pretty volatile. Moving averages can help us see some patterns more clearly, and it's applicable to really volatile data sets, for example, sales and stocks. Let us now look at how we can create and use date parameters. For example, if you have a line chart and you want your end users to be able to select a certain date interval, we can use 2 date parameters, one for the starting date and one for the ending date. So let's create the 2 parameters first. On the drop down, create parameter. Let's call the first one from date. This is going to be a date data type. Let's set the current value to January 1st, 2018. Let's also set the display format. So on the drop down, I'm going to choose a full date, and we are going to leave the allowable values to all. So it's going to show as a calendar picker. Let's click OK. Let's duplicate this parameter and let's edit the duplicate edit. And let's call this one to date. And let's set this to 12/31, 2019. Let's click OK. Now let us show both of these parameters. Right click on from date, show parameter. Right click on to date, show parameter. To test this out, you can click on the parameter control and it should bring up a calendar picker. Now what we want to do is to use these parameter values in a reference line. And to be exact, we are going to use a reference band. So in your sidebar in the Analytics tab, we are going to choose a reference band. So drag this over. We want to set this at the table level for the month date. Once we open this up, we can select our parameters. So on the drop down, notice in here that even though the parameter is not in your canvas, it is still accessible from the reference line fields. And if all we want to do is to show the parameter value as reference lines, we do not need to create calculated fields because they are visible from this dropdown. So let's set this from date, and let's also set the to date. So as we change these settings, we can also see our view changing. So I'm also just going to change the label. So instead of computation, I'm going to set this to value. Same thing for band 2. So instead of computation, this is going to be value. If we want to make adjustments in formatting, we can also do that. Let's click on OK for now. And let's see what happens when we change the dates. So for example, if I change this to February 1st, we can see that the reference line actually moves. Other things that we may want to do for this particular chart is perhaps change the title so that this reflects the date range and perhaps also the total sales for this particular date range. We can easily add our parameter values because remember, these are global values that are accessible from anywhere in your workbook. So let's double click on that title, sales from, let's insert from date to, and let's also insert to date. If we wanted to add the total sales value, we are going to need to create a calculated field. So let's create that. So under data, on the dropdown, create calculated field. Let's call this sales in date range. Now I will show you some common issues that happen when we try to do this. We may be inclined to think that the only logic we need is an if-else statement. For example, if order date, let's expand this, greater than or equal to our from date, and if the order date is less than or equal to our to date, then sales, and then end. We can put this inside a sum function that gives us the total, and let's click OK. Now to add this field to our title, we need to introduce this field in our canvas. So let's drag sales and date range. Let's put that to detail. Let's double click on our title and let's add our sales and date range. I'm also just going to adjust the font size so it will fit in one line. Now the common issue in here is you are still going to see a range of values. It doesn't really give you the total of all the sales within the selected range. So what happens in here is it actually really gives you sum of sales, but note that this sum of sales is subdivided by the month of order date. The 11,000 is the minimum point, and the 96,000 is the maximum sum of sales within this particular date range. So we need to remember that each one of these points, each one is actually an aggregation. And what we really want is an aggregation of an aggregation. And we can achieve this using a table calculation. So let's adjust this calculated field, and we are going to use a table calculation function called total. So let's right click and edit our sales in date range. Let's take a look at the total function first. When we click on this arrow, we can search for total. And this tells us the total returns the total for the given expression. And in this case, it's going to be the sum of all the sums. We can also technically achieve what we're trying to do using a window sum. So this is going to be the sum of all the sums as well. So let's add total, parentheses, click OK. Notice that this change has introduced that triangle that signifies a table calculation. And what this has also done is removed the range, but now just gives you a grand total. So again, in here, the moment we change our date range, this total should automatically update. Let's now see how we can use parameters to sort stacked bar charts. We use stacked bar charts when it's important for us to show the totals, but at the same time also show the composition that makes up that total. One of the challenges with a stacked bar chart is it's hard to compare individual segments, especially those segments that are stacked. For example, it's hard for us to compare all of the South regions. Parameters can help us with stacked bar charts. It can allow us to select a specific region, and what we can do is move that selected region to the first bar so we can at least compare those, but also have an idea what the total values are. So for this example, we can right-click on region, and from here, we can create a parameter based on these values. So create parameter, and what this does is it automatically populates the settings for this parameter. By default, it only copies the values, so this is going to be a static value. But if we want this to keep on updating every time we open our workbook, we can also choose the second option so that it will update every time the workbook opens. For now, we're going to keep it as static. Let's click OK, and let us show the region parameter. There are two things we want to do. The first one is we want the selected region to be the first color that appears. And the second one is we want to be able to sort the length of the bars of that region in descending fashion. To do this, we have to create a calculated field that captures the values of the selected region. So let's create a calculated field. On the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this selected region sales. And all we want is the sales for that region. So if region is equal to whatever was selected in the parameter is equal to region parameter, then sales. Let's end this. We can also encapsulate this inside a sum function. And let's click OK. First, let's test out the colors. Let's sort the color based on this calculated field. So on the drop-down, sort, and instead of data source order, we're going to set this to field. And under field name, it's going to be the selected region sales. So this is set to ascending fashion. And we will notice right away that the selected region is central, central is blue, and that's showing up as your first bar. Let's test this one more time. If we select West, notice that West is green, and that's the first one that shows up. Now, the next thing we need to do is to sort the actual bars. Right now, these bars are not sorted, but what we want to do is to sort them by the highest value of that segment first. So we're going to do something similar. We're going to set the sort of subcategory, select sort, and from here, we are going to sort by field, and this is based on our selected region sales. And we can see now that this is sorting by the length of the bar. Let's close this, and let's test this out for all of the regions. Central, East, South, and West. Parameters can also be used to filter unrelated data sources. What I have in here are two charts. The first one is sales over time. The second one is a sample chart that shows web traffic. If, for example, we want to put this in a dashboard and we want to be able to select a date that affects both of these, we can use parameters. Note that there is no connection between web traffic and sales over time. They do have a common data type, which is a date. So we can use this date using parameters if we want to affect this view. So let's go to sales over time. Let's just reuse the from date and the to date that we used in a previous example. Let's say these are the parameters we want to use in our calculated field. So on the drop-down, create calculated field, and let's call this within date range. And this can simply be a Boolean value or a true or false value. So we can check if order date is greater than or equal to our from date, and order date is less than or equal to our to date. Let's click OK. Let's put this in our filter and only leave records where it's true. Let's click OK. We can do the exact same thing for our web traffic chart. Let's create a new calculated field. Let's call this within date range as well. Within date range. And this time around, it's going to be visit date is greater than or equal to our from date, and visit date is less than or equal to our to date. Click OK, and let's put it in our filter. Select true, and inside our dashboard, we can show the parameter control, and it will affect both of these charts even though they have unrelated data sources. So let's show the parameter, from date, on the drop-down again, parameters, to date. So if we decide to select from 2017, for example, 2017, then both of these charts are going to be affected. Before we move on to the next use cases, let's look at a construct first that you may need to use often when you're dealing with parameters. One construct that you should be aware of is the case statement, as you are likely to use this a lot. The case statement is a logical operator that allows expressions to be evaluated and uses the value of the first match. We will use this case operator in our calculated fields so we can check what the parameter value is and determine the appropriate value or logic to be applied. Note that when we are comparing text or strings, the values you have in your calculated field must match exactly to the values you have in your parameter list. Even the case has to match. If you accidentally type in a different case, for example, lowercase or uppercase, or if, for example, you added extra spaces or extra punctuation, those won't be considered matches. We need exact matches for this to work. It is also important to note that the case statement is equivalent to using if-else statements if you're more comfortable using if-else statements. We tend to use the case statement more, especially for parameter matching, because it tends to be more concise and also requires less typing. In some ways, it's also easier to read. In this example, the first few lines that are highlighted, they are equivalent. So whether you choose case or if statement, it will be a matter of preference. So let's now look at a use case where we're allowing our end users to choose the dimensions that are showing up in your view. We can use a parameter if we want our end users to be able to choose which dimensions are being shown on screen. Let's create a new parameter. Let's call this choose dimension. Let's make this a string. And this time around, we are going to choose a list. We're going to enter in exactly the values that we want to show in this parameter drop-down list. Let's add customer, product, and state. Let's click OK. Let's also show the parameter control. Let's right-click and show parameter. Now what we want to do is for this parameter to be able to dictate what is being used in your row shelf. Right now, this is static. This is always going to be a customer name. So in this case, we need to create a calculated field that helps us determine the correct dimension to show. We're going to use our case statement in our calculated field. Let's create a calculated field. Let's call this chosen dimension. So instead of an if-else statement, we are going to use the case statement. So case, let's use our parameter. When customer is chosen, we want the dimension to be the customer name, then customer name. Now let's verify all the other values we have in this parameter list. We also have product and state. So when product is chosen, then we want this to be product name. When state is chosen, then we want this to be the state dimension. End. Remember, we mentioned that this has to be exact. Whatever we type in here in these strings has to match the values we have in that parameter list. Let's click on OK. Now we are going to use this dimension in our row shelf. So replace this and let's sort. If we have a parameter determining our dimensions, we should add additional indicators that remind our end users what they're looking at. And a good place to do this will be at the title level. Let's double click on the title. This is going to be sales by, and let's insert our parameter value. We can also make this a slightly different color, so it's an indicator that this value is dynamic or that this value can change. Now we can hide the field labels. So we can right-click on this chosen dimension, right-click, hide field labels. And now let's test this out. This is by customer, by product, and by state. We can do something similar if what we're trying to swap in and out are measures and aggregations. For example, if we want to show total sales sometimes, total profit sometimes, maybe average sales and average profit, we can use parameters for that. Let's create a new parameter. Let's call this choose measure. I will use a string data type for this parameter because I want to be able to use this as a label later on. So on the drop down, string, and under list, total sales, average sales, total profit, average profit, and click OK. Let's show the parameter. And similar to the dynamic dimension, we're going to create a calculated field that helps us determine the correct measure to show. So on the drop-down, create calculated field. Let's call this chosen measure. We're going to use case statement again. Case. Let's drag our parameter over. When total sales is selected, then we want the sum of sales. When total profit, then we want the sum of profit. When average sales, then AVG sales. When average profit, then AVG profit. And end. Let's click on OK. Let's change the default format of this new measure. So right click, default properties, number format, make this currency custom 0 decimal places. And once we are ready, we can swap out this chosen measure to what we have in our row shelf right now. So drag this over. Let's test this out first. Average sales, total profit, average profit. Let's add some indicators so it's very clear what the chart shows and what the chart represents. Let's change our title. Let's add our parameter name. This is choose measure. Let's call this over time. Adjust the formatting a little bit. Click OK. So again, test this out. Total sales, average sales. We have total profit, also average profit. One reason I have chosen a string for the parameter data type is because I want to be able to use this as a label that simulates an axis. So let's drag choose measure over. This will give us whatever the chosen measure is. We are going to remove the axis title as well as the field label. Let's right click on the axis, edit axis. Let's remove this title. Let's rotate our header and remove our field labels. So right click, hide field labels. One last check. Total sales. This should now be shown both on the title and what simulates our axis. Average sales, total profit, average profit. One more use case that introduces interactivity is allowing our end users to choose which charts to show. This is also sometimes called dynamic sheet swapping. This is a well-documented technique that utilizes layout containers and filters, and the actual sheet swapping needs to happen at the dashboard level. I have 3 charts in here that I want to swap: a bar chart, a line chart, and a map. And the technique in here is to make sure you have a layout container, either a horizontal or a vertical. Make sure the charts you want to show are all in the same container. And the reason for that is all of the contents in a container will take up 100% of that space. So when you have multiple charts, for example, in the same container, let's say we have 3 of them in here, and if a couple of these charts disappear, whatever is left will occupy the rest of the space. Let us start by creating a parameter that has our chart choices. So on the drop-down, create parameter. Let's call this choose chart. This is going to be a string, and our choices are going to be in a list. Click on list. Let's select all, bar, line, and map. Click OK, and let us show this parameter. Now what we want to do is to add something to filters that will evaluate to true if the selection is either all or bar. The caveat here though is the filter shelf will not accept your parameter. Therefore, we need to create a calculated field. So let's create a calculated field. Let's call this chosen chart. And the only value we need inside this calculated field is the parameter value. So let's drag that over and click OK. Let's put this in the filter shelf. And in here, we are going to evaluate the values based on a custom value list. So we will create our own list that will allow our calculated field to be evaluated to true. And in this case, for our bar chart, the values that should be true will be all. Let's click on the plus sign and bar. So what we are saying is if the choice is all, then it matches a value. If the choice is bar, it also matches a value. So it should evaluate to true and retain the chart. However, if the value is neither of these, the chart should disappear. So let's try this out. Let's click OK. Right now the choice is all, therefore we are seeing the chart. If we select bar, we should still see the chart. If we select line, the chart should disappear. If we select map, the chart should also disappear. We need to do the exact same steps for the remainder of the charts that we have. So I'm just going to do that quickly. I'm going to set the parameter value to all first, and let's set up all of our charts in our dashboard. So in our dashboard, we're going to add a vertical container, and we are going to put the 3 charts here. Let's put the bar. Let's set the parameter to floating for now. Let's add the other 2 charts. Let's add the line. Make sure they're in the same container, and let's also add the map. And now let's take a look at what happens when we change our parameter choice. Right now, this is all, but if we decide that we only want a bar, the bar chart remains, but the line and the map, they disappear. If we select line, the other 2 charts disappear. If we select a map, the map is retained, but the line and the bar chart, they disappear. So right now, all we need to do is clean up the formatting. In this case, we are going to hide the title so that the chart swapping is a little bit more seamless. Let's try it again. All, bar, line, and map. Let's review how parameters and filters are different. I do have a full video explaining filters if you would like a refresher. I will link it up in the card above and description down below. A parameter is independent of the data source, while a filter is dependent on a data source. We can also see this manifest itself when we add quick filters. For example, if I add a quick filter for sum of sales, show the filter. See how the filter has exact numbers in the boundaries? It is because this is derived from the underlying data. With our parameters, we can set our own values and our own boundaries. A parameter's scope is at the workbook level. It can be seen by any worksheet within the same workbook. However, filters, they're applicable by default at the worksheet level. We can, however, apply our filters to different worksheets if we want to. The purpose of a filter is to narrow down data. However, a parameter is not limited to just narrowing down data. Maybe it's something that we can use in calculated fields or reference lines or filters. That's another thing we should note. Parameters can be used in calculated fields, whereas our filters, we cannot embed them inside expressions. In terms of form, filters can have multi-select values. Parameters at this point are single select or open form or based on a list. Actions are available for parameters, but not available for filters, which leads us to the final topic. There are parameter actions. This enables parameter changes to be done through interaction with your view, either by using hover, select, or menu. Let's take a look at the final use case. For this example, we are going to add some dynamic reference lines. To add some dynamic reference lines, let's start by creating 2 parameters, one for a sales threshold and another one for a profit threshold. So on the drop-down, create parameter. Let's start with our sales threshold. Sales threshold. Let's set this to be an integer. Let's set the display format to currency, 0 decimal places. Let's click OK, and let's show this parameter. Let's add a second parameter. So on the drop-down, create parameter. This time around, this is going to be the profit threshold. Profit threshold. Let's set this to integer as well. Display format, currency, 0 decimal places. And click OK. Let us display this parameter as well. Let us now add 2 reference lines that use the threshold values. So in your sidebar, in the Analytics tab, let's drag over reference line. Let us start with sum of sales. This should use the sales threshold value. So on the drop-down, sales threshold. In terms of label, let's set this to custom. Let's type in sales and add the value. So in this arrow, select value. Let's set the formatting so that this is a dashed line. We're also going to fill below. So just a light gray shading. Click OK. Let's do the same thing for our profit threshold. Drag a reference line. This time around, we're still targeting the table scope, but we are only looking at sum of profit. We're going to use our profit threshold. Under label, it's going to be custom. Let's call this profit and still display the value. Set the line to be dashed. And we are also going to fill below. Click OK. One more formatting change. We're just going to move the labels to the right and the label to the top. So let's right-click, Format. Under Reference Line Label, we're going to change our alignment. So horizontal alignment to the right, vertical alignment to the top. Let's do the same thing for profit. Right-click, Format, Alignment is to the right and to the top. Let's just test this out first. If we change the value of our sales threshold and our profit threshold manually, we should expect these reference lines to change. So for example, sales threshold of 1,000 and profit threshold of 1,000. So we can see that they're changing. Now what we want to do is for these parameter values to dynamically change. When we hover over any of these circles, we want the corresponding sales value to change our sales threshold, and our profit value of that selected circle should also change the profit threshold. And to do that, we need to add our parameter actions. We need to add 2. So under Worksheet, Actions, we're going to add the first one for sales, add action, change parameter. This one is for sales. We're going to set this action to run on hover. We're targeting our sales threshold. And we are going to use the sum of sales value. Sum of sales. Click OK. Let's add one more action for profit. Add action, change parameter. This time around, this is for profit. It's going to run on hover as well. We are going to target our profit threshold. And we are going to use the total profit or the sum of profit. Click OK. Let's give this a try. When we hover over any of these circles, the sales threshold and profit threshold values should change. And in here, we can see that this is fairly responsive. Every time we hover over, the reference lines are actually changing. We have covered a lot in this video. We talked about parameters, what they are, how we can create them. We also demoed 10 different use cases that use parameters. And we've covered tips and tricks as well as common constructs like case and if-else statements. We've also highlighted the differences between parameters and filters and also did a quick introduction to parameter actions. I hope you found this video useful. I hope you learned something new. I hope this has helped you understand parameters a little bit better. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you again next time.